What if I told you that the greatest empire in history lost its belief in its own invincibility in just 3 days? Rome, accustomed to dictating its will to the entire world, believed that its legions were capable of crushing any enemy. They conquered deserts, mountains, and seas, but they were not prepared for an enemy that could hide not behind walls, but among trees and fog. In 9 AD, 3 legions under the command of Publius Varus entered the heart of the Germanic forest, confident that they were heading for a quick victory. They marched in a narrow column along a muddy road, accompanied by wagons, women, and children. After all, no one expected war. But each step led them deeper into a trap, where rain turned the ground into a swamp and arrows fell from nowhere. This ambush, planned by the Germanic chieftain Arminius, who had been educated in Rome itself, became one of the most crushing defeats in history. When the battle was over, 3 legions had disappeared. No banners, no commanders, no hope remained. For Rome, it was not just a loss of men, it was a blow to the idea of its eternal domination. Watch the video to the end to find out how Arminius turned Roman discipline against the Romans themselves, why Emperor Augustus could not forget the cry, "Varro, give me back my legions," for the rest of his life, and how this battle permanently halted Rome's expansion northward, changing the map of Europe for millennia to come. I will reveal the best-kept secret of that time. It is that Rome fell victim to its own propaganda. By 9 AD, the empire considered the lands east of the Rhine to be almost conquered. This new province, Germania Magna, was already a fait accompli for the Romans, and all that remained was to civilize it. The Romans built forts, laid roads, and began to introduce their laws, without doubting their right to do so. They believed that their culture and order were a blessing for all peoples. This belief in their own civilizational superiority became their Achilles heel. Publius Quinctilius Varus was appointed to head this new province. He was not so much a soldier as an experienced administrator and lawyer who had previously successfully governed Syria. Augustus appointed him to begin the process of fully integrating Germany into the empire, introducing taxes, conducting trials according to the Roman model, and resolving disputes between tribes. The very fact of his appointment indicated that Augustus considered the military phase to be largely complete. Varus treated the Germans not as warriors, but as future subjects. Varus traveled through the province with a huge civilian convoy that followed his 3 legions. He was accompanied by his family, servants, scribes, lawyers, and tax collectors. He held court right in the camp, settling land disputes and imposing fines. This behavior demonstrated a complete misunderstanding of the local culture, where the law of the strong and tribal traditions took precedence over the written laws of Rome. His actions caused a dull but still silent irritation. The Germanic tribes, which the Romans considered fragmented and primitive, had a complex social structure and deeply valued their freedom. The introduction of the Roman bureaucratic machine, taxes on property they hardly had, and alien laws was perceived as a direct insult. They were willing to put up with military garrisons, but not with a total change in their way of life. This cultural divide was much deeper than the Rhine. Varus, being an experienced Roman aristocrat, did not see or did not want to see these warning signs. He relied on reports from his officers and allies among the local nobility. He believed that the Germans, seeing the power and order of Rome, would themselves want to become part of this great world. His camp was open to local chiefs, he feasted with them and trusted them. This self-confidence was the first step towards disaster. For Rome at that time, there was no such thing as unconquerable lands. If the legions went somewhere, that land became Rome. The Alps, Gaul, Spain, Illyria, all were conquered and Romanized. The Romans could not imagine that these damp, dark forests east of the Rhine would be any different. They believed that the question was not whether Germany would become a province, but when. This illusion of complete control created an atmosphere of relaxation and complacency. The legions stationed in Germania, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, were experienced, but they had not been involved in major battles for a long time. They were engaged in construction, patrolling, and guarding the governor. They were accustomed to their appearance inspiring awe rather than provoking attack. Var did not notice that his actions to pacify the province were actually uniting the scattered tribes. Chiefs who had been feuding with each other for centuries over pastures and influence suddenly found a common enemy. This enemy was not just a soldier, but a tax collector and judge who was destroying their familiar world. All that was missing was a leader who could channel this anger. The empire was blinded by its own success. Augustus himself, a wise and cautious ruler, believed that the empire's border would soon reach the Elbe River. He invested heavily in the infrastructure of the new province. This belief that history had already been written and that Germany would become Roman was a fundamental mistake that cost Rome 3 legions. We are very interested to hear your point of view. Do you think this overconfidence was Rome's main mistake, or was betrayal inevitable anyway? Write about it in the comments, and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next episodes where we analyze turning points in history.
They have taken our land. They have shed our blood today.
Are you ready to learn the truth about the man who played both sides and deceived an entire empire? At the center of it all is one of the most tragic and controversial figures in history, Arminius. He was not just a Germanic barbarian, he was a product of the Roman system itself. The son of the chieftain of the Cherusci tribe, he was sent to Rome as a hostage in his youth, which was a common practice to ensure the loyalty of conquered peoples. In Rome, Arminius received the best education. He was raised as a Roman aristocrat, mastered Latin, learned the art of rhetoric, and, most importantly, thoroughly studied Roman military tactics. He served in the Roman army, commanding auxiliary Germanic troops, and for his loyal service was granted Roman citizenship and the honorary status of equestrian. For Rome, he was the perfect example of a civilized barbarian. Upon arriving in Germany, Quinctilius Varus immediately took Arminius under his wing. He saw him as the ideal mediator. Arminius was one of their own, both for the Romans and the Germans. He became Varus's chief advisor on local affairs, his translator, and, as Varus believed, his loyal friend. Arminius attended all military councils and knew the strength of the legions, their routes, and their plans. Varus trusted him completely. But beneath the mask of a loyal Roman officer lurked a Cheruscan chieftain. Arminius saw how Roman taxes and laws humiliated his people. His Roman education did not instill loyalty in him, but rather an understanding of how Rome could be defeated. He realized that in open battle, the Germanic tribes had no chance against the legions. But he also knew all the weaknesses of the Roman military machine: its sluggishness, dependence on logistics, and overconfidence. Unbeknownst to Varus, Arminius began his master plan. He used his position to travel between tribes, forming a secret alliance. It was an incredibly difficult task. The Germanic tribes, the Cherusci, the Bructeri, the Marsi, and the Chatti, had been at war with each other for generations. Only a common and very powerful enemy, as well as a charismatic leader whom everyone would believe could unite them. Arminius succeeded in doing this. He convinced the chiefs that Rome would not stop until it had taken away the last thing they had left: their freedom and way of life. He presented them with a plan, not just an uprising, but the total destruction of the Roman presence. And the key to this plan was his friend, Quinctilius Varus. Arminius knew that the legions would soon leave for their winter quarters on the Rhine, and this was his only chance. Arminius' plan was brilliant in its simplicity. He was not going to storm the Roman fortresses. He decided to lure the legions to a place where all their tactics, discipline, and heavy weaponry would be useless. He decided to lure them into a trap where the forest, the swamp, and bad weather would become the Germans' main allies. To do this, he simply had to give Varus the right advice. Arminius's double dealing required incredible self-control. He continued to dine with Varus every day, discussing the administration of the province with him, while at the same time giving orders to prepare an ambush. His own father-in-law, the chieftain Segestes, was a staunch supporter of Rome and suspected Arminius. He even warned Varus directly about the conspiracy, but Varus dismissed it as tribal intrigue. Varus trusted the charming, educated Arminius more than the sullen, old barbarian Segestes. This trust, based on the illusion that a Roman upbringing guaranteed loyalty, proved fatal. Arminius was not just a traitor in the eyes of Rome. He was a symbol of the failure of their system of civilization. How difficult do you think it was to play such a double game, looking every day into the eyes of the man you were preparing to destroy? But even the most ingenious plan of betrayal is useless without the perfect battlefield. In the next chapter, you will learn how Arminius turned the landscape itself into his main weapon and how this fateful march began. What I am about to show you was not just a battle, but a perfectly staged spectacle where every step of the Romans was calculated in advance. It was the fall of 9 AD. The campaign season was coming to an end, and Quinctilius Varus was preparing to withdraw his 3 legions, 7, 13, and 19, from their summer camps deep in Germany back to their winter quarters in fortified forts on the Rhine. It was a routine maneuver that the army performed every year. It was at this moment that Arminius' plan came into action. Varus received an urgent report of an alleged uprising by one of the distant tribes. The report was delivered by Arminius himself and other Germanic chiefs loyal to him. They assured Varus that the uprising was insignificant, but required the governor's immediate intervention to demonstrate Rome's power and nip the rebellion in the bud. Arminius suggested that Varus cut across country. Instead of moving along the familiar, wide, and safe military road that ran along the Lipa River, he advised leading the legions straight through the Teutoburg Forest. He argued that this route would allow them to reach the rebels faster, take them by surprise, and quickly return to their winter quarters. It was a classic proposal appealing to Roman efficiency. Quinctilius Varus, trusting his advisor completely, agreed. He saw no reason to doubt a man who had served Rome so faithfully. The decision to deviate from the safe route was made. The legions, along with a huge convoy of civilians, soldiers' families, servants, and merchants, entered the dense, unknown forest. It was the first step into a trap. The army, stretched out for many kilometers, was not a formidable fighting force, but a vulnerable target. The Roman army was always organized on the march, but the terrain did not allow for order to be maintained. Narrow forest paths littered with fallen trees, and the need to cut through thickets slowed their progress. The column stretched out, according to various estimates, for 15 or even 20 kilometers. As soon as the Romans entered the forest, Arminius and other Germanic leaders accompanying Varus asked permission to leave the column. Under the pretext of gathering loyal auxiliary troops to help the Romans, they separated from the main army. Varus calmly let them go. At that moment, the trap snapped shut. The traitors rode off to their warriors, who were already gathered and ready to attack. The terrain chosen by Arminius was ideal for his plan. It was an area of hills, dense forests, and vast swamps. The Romans did not know these trails, while the Germans felt at home here. The forest prevented the legionaries from forming battle lines, and the marshes limited their maneuverability. Arminius knew exactly where he was leading Varus. This march was not just a movement, it was psychological warfare. With every step deeper into the forest, the Romans became more vulnerable. They were cut off from their supply bases, their intelligence was blind, and their long, unwieldy column was ideal for an ambush. Varus placed his fate in the hands of one man. The very fact that Varus took a full civilian train with him on a punitive expedition speaks to his complete lack of caution. He did not expect serious resistance and viewed the campaign as a police operation. This decision fatally slowed the army and made it even more cumbersome. The soldiers were forced not only to fight, but also to protect thousands of non-combatants. The Romans entered the forest, which was soon to become their common grave. They marched, obeying orders, unaware that a few kilometers ahead, thousands of warriors were waiting for them, ready at the signal of their leader. Every step of the Roman soldier was part of Arminius's plan. If you like how we reveal little-known details and tactical tricks that led to great events, please like this video. It really helps us create new content. What if everything you've been taught about the invincible Roman army doesn't work in this place? The strength of the Roman legion lay in its discipline, organization, and ability to fight in formation. In open terrain, the legion was like a well-oiled machine, a living wall of shields and spears. But Arminius led the Romans to a place where all these advantages were rendered useless. As soon as the Roman column entered the forest, another ally of the Germanic tribes descended upon them: the weather. A violent storm began with torrential rain and hurricane-force winds. The forest paths, already narrow, instantly turned into a sticky swamp. Mud stuck to the colleague sandals. Heavy carts got stuck, breaking axles and blocking movement. The pace of the march slowed to almost zero. This rain also had tactical significance. The large rectangular shields of the Romans, scutum, were made of layers of wood covered with leather. They absorbed water, becoming unbearably heavy. The soldiers could barely lift them, losing their main protection. In addition, the bowstrings of the Roman bows, made of sinew, became wet and useless, depriving the legions of long-range support. It was under these conditions that the first attacks began. It was not an open battle. The Germans, light and mobile, without heavy armor, attacked from behind the trees. They threw javelins and spears at the stretched-out column, inflicting damage and instantly disappearing into the thicket before the Romans could react. For the legionaries, accustomed to seeing the enemy in front of them, it was a nightmare. The Romans were trapped. They could not pursue the attackers in the dense forest, as this would mean breaking formation and certain death one by one. Nor could they defend themselves effectively, as the column was too stretched out. All they could do was slowly crawl forward, suffering losses and hope for an exit to open space. Varus, finally realizing the extent of the betrayal and disaster, attempted to restore order. He ordered a camp to be set up right in the forest. This was standard Roman procedure. Every night, the army erected a fortified camp. But in the rain, mud, and constant attacks, building the camp turned into a desperate attempt to survive until morning. The next day, a difficult decision was made to abandon and burn most of the baggage train. The carts that were supposed to carry supplies and spoils had now become a deadly burden. It was a desperate move to increase the speed and mobility of the column. Thousands of civilians who had followed the army were left defenseless, and their presence caused even greater chaos. The Romans tried to break through. They were no longer marching as a proud army, but as a disorganized crowd fighting off an invisible enemy. The forest, which was supposed to be just an obstacle, turned into a living enemy. Every tree hid a threat. Every ravine could be an ambush. The psychological pressure was no less than the physical. The Germans did not give them a moment's rest. They hung on the flanks and rear of the column, not engaging in decisive battle, but constantly exhausting the Romans. Arminius used the tactic of 1,000 cuts, slowly bleeding the legions dry before delivering the final blow. He knew full well that the main course awaited the Romans ahead, a specially prepared trap. The Roman officers, the centurions, tried to rally the soldiers, but what could discipline do against nature itself? The legionaries were trained to fight people, not forests, rain, and mud. Their heavy armor and short gladius swords were useless against an enemy that did not come within striking distance. How do you think an ordinary Roman soldier felt at that moment, realizing that his commanders had lost control and his famous legion was simply dissolving into the forest? But this exhaustion was only a prelude. In the next chapter, you will learn about the main part of the trap, the place the Germans had prepared for the final decision of the fate of the three legions. After fighting their way through the forest for 2 or 3 days, constantly repelling attacks, the Roman column was at the end of its strength. The soldiers were physically and mentally exhausted. They had not slept, had eaten almost nothing, and had lost all sense of where they were going. They simply moved forward, hoping for a miracle, not knowing that this was exactly what Arminius was waiting for. He did not simply attack. He methodically drove them to one specific place. That place was a narrow pass, which modern archaeologists identify as the area near the hill of Calchris. It was a perfect natural trap, as if specially created for Arminius's plan. On one side of the road stood a forest-covered hill, and on the other stretched a vast, impassable peat bog known as the Great Moor. The passage between the hill and the bog was very narrow, only a few hundred meters wide. At this point, the stretched-out Roman column was forced to squeeze even tighter, turning into a perfect target. The legionaries had absolutely no room for maneuver. They could not get around the trap. The bog was impassable, and the hill was steep and wooded. But Arminius did not rely solely on nature. In preparation for the ambush, his warriors did a titanic job. Along the entire hill, parallel to the path the Romans were supposed to take, they built an earthen rampart. This wall, several hundred meters long, was reinforced with a palisade and hidden behind trees. It served as an ideal parapet for the Germanic warriors. Arminius placed his main fresh forces behind this rampart. Thousands of warriors waited, hidden from the eyes of the Romans. They were on high ground, protected by the wall and the forest. They could throw spears and javelins down on the Roman column with impunity, remaining virtually invulnerable to retaliation. It was not an ambush, it was a shooting range. When the head of the exhausted Roman column entered this narrow passage, they may not have even realized immediately what had happened. Suddenly, from the left flank, from the hill, a barrage of weapons rained down on them. Arminius's warriors began a methodical bombardment from pre-prepared positions. The Romans found themselves trapped between a wall of fire from the hill and an impassable swamp. The chaos that reigned in the column is difficult to imagine. The front ranks, which were under attack, tried to retreat, but they were pushed by those behind them, who did not yet understand what was happening. The column merged into a single, disorganized mass of people and animals. The discipline that had been the last bastion of the legions collapsed in an instant. The Romans desperately tried to attack. Some groups of soldiers, led by centurions, rushed up the slope, trying to storm the rampart, but they were in heavy armor, storming uphill on wet ground and under a hail of spears. These attacks were doomed from the start. The Germans easily repelled these scattered attempts. The swamp on the other side also played its part. Trying to take cover from the fire from the hill, many soldiers and animals strayed from the path and immediately got stuck in the mire. The swamp became as deadly a trap as the rampart. The Romans had no way forward, backward, or sideways. This was the culmination of Arminius' plan. He used his knowledge of the terrain, his engineering training, and the weaknesses of Roman tactics to create the perfect conditions for destruction. The legions were caught in a bottleneck from which there was no escape. They were no longer an army, but merely a collection of people awaiting their fate. Guess what happened next when the perfect war machine encountered the perfect trap? At that moment, the legions ceased to exist as organized combat units. Everything that made them strong, their formation, command, tactics, was wiped out. The surviving soldiers huddled together in small groups, known as hedgehogs, trying to defend themselves back to back. But this was only a delay. Seeing that the resistance had been broken, the Germanic warriors at Arminius' signal poured out from behind the rampart. They rushed down on the disorganized and panicked column. The final stage of the battle began, in which the Romans did not stand a chance. They were trapped, exhausted, and unable to use their main weapon, the short gladius sword designed for close combat in formation. The Roman command was completely paralyzed. Centurions and legates who tried to rally the troops became the first targets. Communication between the parts of the column had long been lost. Everyone fought for themselves, but in such conditions it was useless. The Germans, fighting on their own land and inspired by victory, were unstoppable. It was at this moment, seeing the complete and irreversible collapse of his army, that Quinctilius Varus made his final decision. As a Roman aristocrat for whom the greatest shame was not death but capture by barbarians, he did what he considered the only dignified thing to do. He and many of his senior officers decided to take their own lives rather than fall into enemy hands. With the departure of the high command, the army was completely decapitated. Resistance became chaotic and quickly died out. The 17th, 18th, and 19th legions, as well as all the cavalry and auxiliary cohorts, were completely scattered. Very few managed to escape from this cauldron and eventually reached the Rhine through the forests and swamps. The most terrible symbol of defeat was the loss of 3 legionary eagles, or aquilae. For Rome, the eagle was not just a banner, it was a sacred symbol of the legion, its soul. The loss of an eagle was considered the greatest disgrace that could befall an army. The capture of 3 eagles at once by the Germans was an indelible stain on Rome's reputation. The battle, or rather the 3-day massacre, was over. The army that had confidently entered the forest a few days earlier had simply ceased to exist. Tens of thousands of trained soldiers and civilians were swallowed up by the forest. It was not just a victory for the Germans, it was total destruction. One of the most devastating disasters in the military history of Rome. Arminius had achieved his goal. He had not only defeated Rome, he had humiliated it. He proved that the legions were not invincible and that the Germanic lands would never become a Roman province. The consequences of this event went far beyond the battlefield in the Teutoburg Forest. They reached Rome itself and changed the course of history. This defeat was a lesson that Rome would never forget. Varus' pride and unwillingness to heed warnings led to disaster. At the same time, Arminius' genius, his knowledge of Roman psychology and tactics, allowed him to plan and execute the perfect ambush. The forest and the swamp became his best soldiers. Do you think the legions had any chance of survival after they entered the forest? The complete destruction of 3 legions was not just a military defeat. In the next chapter, we will learn how it caused psychological shock throughout the empire and drove the emperor himself to bang his head against the wall. When the first news of the disaster reached Rome, brought by the few who had managed to escape, they were not believed at first. It seemed impossible. 3 entire legions could not simply disappear. However, as new confirmations arrived, disbelief gave way to horror and then panic. The empire, at the height of its power, felt vulnerable for the first time in a long time. The loss of nearly 20,000 professional soldiers, which constituted about 10% of the empire's entire army, was a colossal military blow. But even more frightening was the psychological blow. For the first time since the invasion of the Cimbri and Teutons 100 years earlier, there was a real threat of a barbarian invasion of Gaul and even Italy itself. The border on the Rhine was virtually defenseless. Emperor Augustus, by that time an elderly and wise ruler, was, according to contemporary accounts, utterly devastated. He took it not just as a military failure, but as a personal tragedy and the collapse of his life's work of expanding and strengthening the empire. He saw it as a bad omen for the future of Rome. The Roman historian Suetonius writes that Augustus was so shaken that he did not cut his hair or beard for months as a sign of mourning. He was often seen banging his head against a doorframe with a desperate cry that went down in history: "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions." This phrase became a symbol not only of grief, but also of the realization that a fatal, irreparable mistake had been made. Emergency measures were taken in Rome. Martial law was declared in the city, and urgent recruitment took place throughout Italy to make up for the losses and send fresh forces to the Rhine. Augustus was forced to resort to harsh measures to recruit soldiers, as few were willing to go to the cursed Germanic forest. This disaster changed the Roman army forever. The numbers of the lost legions, 17, 17, and 19, were removed from the list. They became cursed numbers, and no legion in Roman history ever bore them again. It was an eternal reminder of the greatest shame and tragedy. Fear of Germany became deeply ingrained in the Roman consciousness. The lands beyond the Rhine came to be seen as a wild, hostile, and uncivilized place, inhabited by fierce warriors who could not be conquered. The illusion of Germania Magna was shattered overnight. The consequences for domestic politics were also significant. The defeat undermined Augustus's authority and provoked criticism of his expansionist policy. Although Augustus retained power, he had to revise his entire strategy on the northern borders. The catastrophe was a turning point in his reign. The psychological trauma was so profound that Rome abandoned any serious attempts to conquer the lands east of the Rhine for many years. The focus shifted from conquest to defense. This battle did not just stop the legions, it stopped the very idea of a limitless empire. Augustus sent his best commander and adopted son, Tiberius, to the Rhine to stabilize the front. Tiberius' task was not to take revenge or reclaim land, but to strengthen the border along the Rhine and prevent Germanic incursions into Gaul. Rome switched to a strategy of defense. The immediate and most long-term consequence of the battle in the Teutoburg Forest was a radical change in Roman border strategy. The dream of expanding the empire to the Elbe River, which had seemed so close, was buried. Emperor Augustus, taught by bitter experience, explicitly recommended in his will that his successor Tiberius adhere to the existing borders and not attempt to expand the empire. The Rhine River, which until 9 AD had been considered a temporary starting point for further eastward expansion, now became a permanent, heavily fortified border. For the next 400 years, the Rhine and Danube would define the limits of the Roman world. This border, born of defeat, determined the cultural and political division of Europe for centuries. The Romans completely abandoned all their fortresses and settlements built east of the Rhine. Huge investments in the infrastructure of the new province, roads, bridges, forts, were lost. Archaeological finds, such as the Roman camp at Waldgurms, which was clearly built as a civil administrative center, show how serious Rome's intentions were and how abruptly they were cut short. This new defensive doctrine was called the Limes. A complex system of fortifications was built along the Rhine and Danube, including watchtowers, forts for legions and auxiliary units, and roads for the rapid movement of troops. Rome no longer sought to conquer the barbarians. It sought to isolate itself from them. The defeat at Varus showed the Romans the limits of their military power. They realized that their legions, invincible in the open spaces of the Mediterranean and Gaul, were vulnerable in the specific conditions of the dense forests and swamps of the north. This made them treat the Germanic tribes with great respect and, at the same time, with great fear. For the Germanic tribes, this victory was of enormous significance. They had defended their independence and halted the seemingly inexorable march of Romanization. Arminius became a legendary hero, a symbol of Germanic freedom. Although he was unable to create a unified Germanic state, his victory ensured that the Germanic tribes would develop along their own path, outside of Roman influence. This event had far-reaching linguistic and cultural consequences. If Rome had conquered Germany, modern Germans, Dutch and English, would most likely speak Romance languages, like the French or Spanish. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest ensured the survival and development of the Germanic language family. Roman military tactics also underwent changes. The army began to pay more attention to reconnaissance, the use of local guides, and adaptation to combat operations in rough terrain. Lessons were learned from Varus's overconfidence, and Roman commanders began to act much more cautiously in Germany. Although Rome abandoned conquest, it did not abandon intervention. In the following decades, Roman policy in Germany was based on the principle of divide and rule. Roman diplomats skillfully played on the contradictions between the tribes, supporting some chiefs against others in order to prevent the creation of a new powerful alliance similar to the one Arminius had assembled. Thus, 3 days in the Teutoburg Forest did not simply destroy 3 legions. They drew a line that, in a sense, still exists today. It was a moment when history could have taken a completely different path, but the genius of Arminius and the self-confidence of Varus steered it in the direction we know. The victory in the Teutoburg Forest made Arminius the most powerful and respected leader among the Germanic tribes. He achieved what seemed impossible. Not only did he defeat the legions, but he completely destroyed them, driving the Romans out of his lands. He was at the height of his glory, but as is often the case, staying at the top proved more difficult than reaching it. Arminius' main goal after his victory was to create a united and powerful alliance of Germanic tribes that would be able to protect Germany from the Roman threat forever. He dreamed of becoming king of a united nation. However, this dream was met with harsh reality. Centuries of disunity and enmity between the tribes. The Germanic chiefs, who willingly united against a common enemy, had no desire to submit to one of their own. They valued their tribal independence above the idea of national unity. As soon as the Roman threat receded beyond the Rhine, the old feuds flared up with renewed vigor. In their eyes, Arminius went from being a liberator to a potential tyrant. One of his most bitter enemies was Merobod, chieftain of the Marcomanni tribe. He had established a powerful kingdom in what is now the Czech Republic and saw Arminius as a direct rival. A war broke out between the two most powerful Germanic leaders, which benefited only Rome, which watched with pleasure as its enemies weakened each other. Rome did not sit idly by either. Roman diplomacy was actively working to support pro-Roman parties within the tribes. Arminius's main opponent on this front was his own father-in-law, the Cherusci chieftain Segestes. Segestes had always been loyal to Rome and hated his son-in-law for his betrayal. He saw Arminius as a usurper who had disturbed the peace of Germania. This internal conflict led to Arminius's personal tragedy. During one of the civil wars, Segestes captured Arminius's pregnant wife, Thusnelda, and handed her over to the Romans. Arminius never saw her again. She was taken to Rome, where she was paraded in Germanicus' triumphal procession as a valuable trophy. Arminius himself continued to fight successfully for several years against the Roman punitive expeditions led by Germanicus. He engaged him in battle several times, and although he was unable to repeat the triumph of Teutoburg, he did not allow Germanicus to conquer Germany again. He remained a formidable and elusive opponent. However, his main battle was not with Rome, but with his own tribesmen. His attempts to consolidate his power and create a kingdom provoked increasing resistance. The Germanic nobility feared his authority and popularity among the common soldiers. They saw him as a threat to their ancient freedoms. Arminius' fate turned out to be tragic. He did not fall in battle against the Romans, whom he hated so much. In 21 AD, just 12 years after his greatest triumph, Arminius was eliminated as a result of a conspiracy by his own associates and relatives. They feared that he would proclaim himself king. Thus ended the life of the man who changed the history of Europe. He defeated Rome, but lost to his own people. Despite this, he has remained in the annals of history. For the Romans, he was a symbol of treacherous betrayal, but for the Germanic peoples, many centuries later, he became a national hero, Germanus the Liberator, a symbol of the struggle for independence. For Rome, the defeat in the Teutoburg Forest was not only a military and political disaster, but also a profound religious and moral disgrace. The loss of the three sacred legionary eagles, aquilae, which were symbols of the honor and power of the Roman Empire, was so tragic that it shook the very foundations of the Roman army and their perception of themselves as an invincible force. The eagle was not just a military banner, but also the divine patron of the legion, symbolizing the unity and strength of the Roman troops. Its loss meant not only defeat, but also spiritual desecration, as if the very essence of Rome had been disgraced. It was much more than a mere military defeat. It was a disgrace that demanded restoration. The loss of the eagles became a symbol that the entire legion had been destroyed not only on the battlefield, but also morally and spiritually. For the Romans, it was a terrible blow, as if their greatness and power had been called into question. The task of returning the lost eagles and restoring Rome's honor was taken on by the young and ambitious commander Germanicus, nephew of the new emperor Tiberius. Germanicus was not only a military leader, but also a man in whom Rome placed great hopes. He was ready to do anything to avenge this disgrace and return the lost sacred objects. Starting in 14 AD, he conducted a series of large-scale punitive expeditions deep into Germany. Unlike earlier attempts at conquest, the goal of these campaigns was not to expand territory, but to restore Rome's honor and take revenge on those who had humiliated its army. Germanicus sought to recover the lost eagles and atone for the disgrace Rome had suffered in the Teutoburg Forest. He knew that victory over the Germans would not only return the lost relics, but also restore Rome's prestige. These campaigns were extremely fierce, as the Germanic tribes, despite Varus' defeat, remained strong and organized. Germanicus and Arminius, the leader of the Germanic tribes, clashed several times in major battles, and these battles became real trials for both sides. The Roman legions, acting with caution, tried to avoid repeating the mistakes made in 9 AD, while Arminius was no longer able to assemble as powerful an alliance as before. After the initial successes of the Germanic tribes, the Romans began to act much more deliberately, knowing that any wrong move could lead to new catastrophic consequences. During one of their raids in 15 AD, the Romans finally captured the camp of the Bructeri tribe and were able to recover the first eagle, the eagle of the 19th Legion, thus taking an important step towards restoring their honor. This event was a symbol that Rome had not forgotten its pride and was ready to fight to the end to regain what it had lost. In the same year, 15 AD, Germanicus led his army to the site of the final battle in the Teutoburg Forest, a place that had become a symbol of great defeat. The Roman historian Tacitus, who witnessed these events, described how Germanicus's soldiers entered this gloomy and silent forest. What they saw left an indelible mark on their hearts. The place where the great battle had once taken place was covered with traces of past violence. Destroyed camps, half-ruined ramparts, scattered weapons, armor, and the remains of carts all bore witness to the great catastrophe that had befallen the Roman legions. Tacitus writes that signs of the triumphal rituals performed by the Germans after their victory hung from the trees. This was the place where the lives of 3 legions had come to an end, and memories of those days still lingered in the air. What the soldiers saw in this forest was so depressing that many of them who served on the Rhine knew personally those who had died here. It was not just a memory of defeat, but also the experience of a tragedy that left a deep mark on the souls of the Romans. On Germanicus' orders, the army performed symbolic funeral rites to honor the memory of the fallen. Despite their grief, the soldiers gathered the scattered equipment and remains of their comrades, trying to recover at least a fraction of what had been lost. They erected a large burial mound, symbolizing that Rome did not forget its soldiers and was ready to honor their memory. This gesture was important for restoring the morale of the army. It showed that Rome did not forget its warriors, that their deaths would not be in vain, and that honor would always be defended, despite the severity of the lost battle. However, for Emperor Tiberius, this act was a violation. At that time, it was believed that visiting the site of a disaster could demoralize the army, causing it to doubt its strength and invincibility. Tiberius, who did not share Germanicus' point of view, believed that these rituals were not only useless, but also harmful to the morale of the soldiers. The following year in 16 AD, Germanicus won a major victory over Arminius at the Battle of Adrastus. This victory was an important step in restoring Roman honor and glory. During this campaign, Germanicus was able to recover the second eagle, that of the 17th Legion, which was a real triumph for Rome. With this success, Germanicus became incredibly popular in Rome and was honored as the avenger of Varus. He restored not only the eagle, but also some of the greatness that had been lost in the Teutoburg Forest. He became a symbol of Roman determination and fortitude, a man who was able to restore Rome's honor in the eyes of the whole world. But not everything was so rosy for Germanicus. Emperor Tiberius, fearing his nephew's growing popularity and considering the Germanic war too expensive and dangerous, recalled him to Rome. Tiberius gave him a lavish triumph, but despite this, he never sent Germanicus to Germany again. He believed that the border along the Rhine should be the final line separating Rome and Germany. Tiberius' decision meant that the Germanic campaign, despite its successes, was over and no further efforts would be made. The third eagle, belonging to the 18th Legion, was only returned in 41 AD during the reign of Emperor Claudius. This eagle was recaptured from the Chatti tribe during a small military operation. Although its return was an important event, it happened much later than the Romans would have liked. Only 32 years later, in 41 AD, was Varus's defeat finally washed away. However, Rome did not forget the lesson taught by Arminius. This defeat was one of those events that left an indelible mark on the history of the Roman Empire. Despite the return of the eagles, Rome would never be the same as it was before the Teutoburg Forest. We have told the story of one of the most devastating and ingenious ambushes in military history. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest was not just a battle, but a turning point that halted the expansion of the world's greatest empire. It was the moment when the illusion of Rome's invincibility was shattered by the reality of the Germanic forests, the tactical genius of Arminius, and the fatal overconfidence of Quinctilius Varus. This event forever drew a line between the Roman and Germanic worlds, defining the cultural and linguistic map of future Europe. For Rome, it was a profound psychological trauma and a lesson about the limits of its power. For the Germanic peoples, it was a great triumph and a symbol of their struggle for independence. What other great battles or turning points in history that changed the world would you like us to explore in future episodes? Suggest your topics in the comments. We are very interested in your opinion. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new research into the past.